This episode is brought to you by Shopify. Whether you're selling a little or a lot, Shopify helps you do your thing, however you cha-ching. From the launch your online shop stage, all the way to the we just hit 1 million orders stage. No matter what stage you're in, Shopify's there to help you grow. Sign up for a $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/special offer, all lowercase. That's shopify.com/special offer.
Whoa. Landing an account this big will totally change my landscaping business. It's going to mean hiring more guys and more equipment and new trucks for the new guys to drive the new equipment in. I don't know if I'm ready.
You can do this, and Ford Pro FinSimple can help. Our experts are ready to make growing pains less painful for your business with flexible financing solutions that meet the needs of your business today when you need them. Get started at fordpro.com/financing.
Hi, I'm Caitlin, a podcast producer here at C-SPAN. This week on C-SPAN's Afterwards podcast, Rockefeller International Chairman Ruchir Sharma explains why he believes capitalism is broken and how it can be fixed. The Cato Institute's Alex Nowrasteh interviews him.
Ruchir Sharma, thank you for being here today to discuss your new book, What Went Wrong with Capitalism. Why don't we just start off by answering the basic question, what did go wrong with capitalism?
Yeah, I think that what's happened is that capitalism has been distorted much beyond what its founders had in mind. That what they had in mind for capitalism was a system which promotes competition, promotes creative destruction, promotes churn. Instead, we have a very distorted form of capitalism today where the average person in America, and in fact across the Western world, feels that the system is almost rigged against them. One of the basic theses of capitalism is that it should at least give the sense that there's going to be an equality of opportunity. I think the average American today feels that there is not even equality of opportunity for them, let alone the fact that, of course, capitalism naturally gravitates itself to inequality of outcomes. But that's supposed to be based on meritocracy. So in short, I think what's gone wrong with capitalism today is that it's been really distorted. As I argue in the book, that the series of government actions have led to a capitalist form today that is very much different from what its founders have in mind. And it includes a suite of government habits. It's not just government spending and deficits and debt that have been rising over time. It's the tendency to regulate, the tendency to bail out companies at the slightest hint of trouble, the tendency to manage or micromanage the business cycle. And of course, in all this is also the role of the US Federal Reserve, where it seems so acutely sensitive to even small fluctuations in the stock market, that it's become this sort of asymmetry that on the upside, people are allowed to gain. On the downside, no one is really allowed to fail. So we've had a socialization of risk that's happened across the system.
So you borrow this phrase from Bernie Sanders in your book, and you use it quite well, where you say, we have what is right now socialism for the rich, and competition or capitalism for the poor. You go into a bunch of details about why that's true to an extent, but then you, of course, finish it off with a massive amount of, with a large amount of the welfare state that exists, which is mostly for middle class people, the poor, and elsewhere, and other types of people who aren't the rich. The takeaway, the question I have from this is, who isn't covered by bailouts in the United States? And how true is Bernie's statement really?
Yes, I think that the statement of Bernie Sanders is the half-truth, which is that it's true that we've had socialism for the rich, but what I argue in the book is that we seem to have socialized risk for everyone. So even the welfare state, of course, has grown exponentially over time. The middle class, like in terms of have got, feel entitled that they need to get like all the benefits or giveaways as well. So it's really become socialized risk for everyone. Now, of course, the most galling part of that is that the rich are also getting their risk be socialized by the government, which is that if any company or large corporate even is on the verge of failure, the government stands ready to bail that company out. And that's something which is very new to American culture, because back in the grand old days of American capitalism, you did not have this format where companies would get bailed out by the American government. The first big bailout of an American financial institution really happened in 1984 with that of Continental Illinois. Before that, in the 50s, 60s, and even the 70s, when the idea was suggested that American government should bail out any company or even financial institution in trouble, it would be met with huge resistance in Washington, that that's not the way America is. But now you've had this very changed situation where every sort of company feels that they're entitled to a bailout. And obviously, when that happens, the person in the middle class or even the poor families feel that if those companies are getting such bailouts, what about me? And even they're getting a lot of government aid and support. But the most galling aspect is obviously when it's applied to the rich, which has become a sort of modern day form of trickle-down economics, which is that when you bail out these big, large corporations, the justification given is that if you don't do that, it will lead to complete economic collapse and it will lead to a lot of people being laid off. But the problem there is that it's a very self-fulfilling argument when you bail out these very rich companies, or even, like last year you had the SVB bailout, which took place of a rich Silicon Valley bank. Then it's really problematic because it sort of makes everyone then feel entitled to the fact that they deserve government support and they deserve to be bailed out.
I mean, it really is quite a change, this bailout culture. When Franklin Roosevelt was governor of New York, the legislature proposed a system of deposit insurance for depositors. And FDR, when he was governor, opposed that. And in his sort of folksy way, he talked about moral hazard, about how having this guarantee for depositors would make them a little lazy in choosing banks that were sound. And as a result, they would choose banks that charged higher or gave them higher interest rates, because if they lost money, the government would bail them out. So it's just all upside. And I've heard moral hazard throughout my education, throughout my career, up through the 2008 bailouts after the financial crisis. But I haven't really heard it said in the last decade or so. What happened to this term? What happened to this idea that bailouts and shielding people from their own mistakes would lead them to make more risky choices that would result in more mistakes? Well, what happened to this idea?
Exactly. I think that's a great point. I think that what's happened is that there is this feeling that if the American economy is doing fine, then why should we worry about moral hazard? If all these bailouts have not led to any apparent crisis, why should we be worried about it? And that's one of the big issues that I address in the book, which is that there is a real price to these bailouts and what you call, like the moral hazard problem, which is that if you look at the productivity in the American economy, and as you know, the key to economic growth is productivity. Productivity in the American economy has been declining for the last few decades. And I link that decline in productivity to this bailout culture that we have in America, which keeps alive a lot of deadwood and also keeps alive or sort of promotes a lot of the big companies from getting bigger. So I think that the reason why this term moral hazard may have faded is that it became a bit, tired and stale, because a lot of people felt, at least the policymakers, that all these people keep telling us about moral hazard, but it's not led to any problem or any apparent problem in the American economy. And that's the link I make, that no, it has led to a problem. It's just that it's much more insidious. Most policymakers tend to view problems as an apparent crisis, in-your-face crisis. So if the government was facing some sort of a fiscal crisis, or it was running out of money to bail out companies, or that was not working, then it would be, this is a problem. But I say that the problem is much more insidious, because it's led to a decline in the number of new startups in America. That's been declining for the last few decades, right up until the pandemic. It's matched by a decline in productivity in the American economy. So the moral hazard is a real problem, just that it's been playing itself out in a more insidious way. And because it's not happening in your face in terms of a big crisis, people or at least policymakers have stopped talking about that. But the average American, as I've argued in the book, is very unhappy at the state of the American economy today. So for the average person, even though they don't think in these terms of moral hazard and stuff, something is not working for them in the way that the American economy is delivering.
You spend some time quoting Joseph Schumpeter, the late Austrian economist who, among his many achievements, he coined the term creative destruction. The idea that market competition and an evolution in the market would weed out a lot of unproductive firms that don't innovate, firms that aren't very dynamic, and free up those resources that are sort of constrained and trapped to go to firms and to entrepreneurs who are more productive and can utilize those resources more effectively, efficiently, that are basically like younger and have new ideas, right? And that this process destroys old companies and causes economic problems and dislocation and unemployment. But the ultimate result is more creativity, more expansion, and more growth. And what you write about, which I think quite eloquently, is describe how policymakers have replaced this system of creative destruction and replaced it with this system of sort of zombie firms, of firms that are supported by the government, that don't innovate. And we see this, I think, most importantly in places like Japan and Europe, and now it's spread to the U.S. What do you think about zombies? Like, what's the role of zombies, and how does crushing creative destruction cause them?
Yeah, so I think that first let's define what is a zombie company, right? Which is that a zombie company, and these are definitions used by institutions such as the Bank of International Settlements and others. These are defined as companies that have not earned enough profits to even make their interest payments for 3 years in a row. So they are forced to keep going back to the market to borrow and to keep themselves alive. So that's defined as a zombie company. Now, this term became popular in Japan in the 1990s, that when the Japanese economy was slowing down appreciably in the 1990s and the bubble was bursting, there was a big rise in the number of zombie companies, or they were classified as zombie companies in Japan. The American media that way, including publications such as the New York Times, would almost mock this phenomenon in Japan, saying that these zombie companies are being kept alive because of artificially low interest rates, easy money. And America is very different. America does not do this. At that point in time, the number of zombie companies in America was roughly about 2% of the total number of listed companies in America. Today, the number of listed companies which can be classified as zombie companies in America is by some measures close to 20% of the total. So just a massive explosion in zombie companies in America and across the Western world, I would say. So in terms of, that's what's happened, that having these very easy money policies, very low interest rates for a long period of time, has kept alive these zombie companies in America. Now, when that happens, that essentially means that you're keeping alive the dead wood. And there's a price for that, because if you keep alive so much dead wood, then you are keeping out new companies from coming in. You are keeping out new startups from prospering. And we have seen the mirror image of that, which is that the number of startups in America has been declining over that period of time. So there's a real price to be paid when these policies are pursued, that you're keeping alive the existing companies. And that feels optically good, that, okay, by keeping alive these existing companies, even though they are not profitable and they are inefficient by every metric, by keeping alive those companies, you are helping maybe in the short term avoid some job losses or so. But what's happening then is that you're choking new competition, you're choking new companies from being formed, and that shows up in the declining number of startup companies in America. So I think that that's what I'm trying to do in this book, to illustrate that there's a real price for these things. And the price often can be insidious, not something apparent and in your face, but if you look at beneath the hood, there's a serious price to all these policies.
Yeah, I mean, you write about this in a lot of detail, right? The price is lower growth in the long term, less innovation, less income growth, less economic mobility. As a result of a lot of these policies, the Federal Reserve plays a large role in this in your book, and other central banks do as well. How does the Fed through its monetary policy or other policies, create this system of low growth and malinvestment and investment in zombie firms and keep them going?
Right. I think that if you just trace back the Fed, and this is where I say that a lot of people think that we entered this, incredible free market era in the 1980s. And yet, if you look at the role of the Fed, there was a seminal shift in it back in 1987. The stock market had a big crash in October of 1987. At that point in time, Alan Greenspan, the Fed chair, for the first time became the head of a major central bank to say that we are going to intervene in a way to help prop up stock prices, which is that he cut interest rates to rescue the stock market at that point in time. That had not been done so explicitly before in America's financial history. Now, once he did that, the signal he sent, and that came to be known in financial market circles as a Greenspan put, which is the fact that on the upside, people were allowed to benefit and to make money. On the downside, this view came about that the Federal Reserve had your back, which is that if the market fell too much, the Fed would intervene to prop up the stock market. And after that, we saw that play itself out repeatedly, where the Fed became very conscious of the stock market and led to this asymmetrical risk as far as the stock market was concerned, that on the upside, people were free to speculate or do what they wanted. On the downside, the Fed would be there to protect that capital. So I think that is what has led to this feeling now that you can make as much money as you want on the upside, and on the downside, the Fed will be there. Now, when you have that, it obviously leads to people making their decisions accordingly when they are going to sort of feel that their losses are going to be socialized, but the profits are all for them to capitalize.
So you are a fund manager. You work in finance. That's been your career. You've seen this play out from the inside. And you sort of have embraced this sort of Austrian business cycle theory, right, of like booms and busts caused by monetary policy dislocations in the long term caused by this. What in your career, when did you have this aha moment where you realized what was going on? Because I just assume that given your front row seat to all of this, you had some moment or some time when you became convinced of this thesis.
Yes, exactly. I think that, it's happened over time. I mean, it started out in my childhood. I trace it back to the 1980s. I grew up in India, which was then a very socialist country. And I saw that, for me, capitalism in America was all about giving people more economic freedom, right? So it started off with a love for capitalism, but it came from a sense of economic freedom with the government playing a role. So I'm not a true Austrian in a way that I think there is a role for the government to be played. The government needs to provide a basic welfare state. The government needs to intervene in crises. But when I saw in America over time that how the government's role kept on increasing, and the government now started to do things which socialist India once used to do, that's really what sort of got to me, that is not what the American brand of capitalism was all about. Now, you speak about the aha moment. I'd say there are a couple of things which really disturbed me. One was that in the 2010s, even once the economic recovery got going, the Federal Reserve then still seemed determined to engage in policies such as quantitative easing, because it felt that as long as inflation was dead, it could pour as much money in the system as was required to try and prop up the economy. So that was a very new policy. Why should the Fed be doing that, which is to throw all sorts of money at the economy, all because it feels that consumer price inflation, defined in a very narrow way, is contained. But what about asset price inflation? What about the fact that property prices are surging, which puts homes outside the reach of the average American? So that was the first moment in the 2010s when I felt something was wrong. And then the idea of this book really took hold in the pandemic, that at the time of the pandemic, the American government decided to shut businesses down. Fine, I mean, it was a serious crisis. And then to compensate for that, to just throw out incredible amount of stimulus, the kind of stimulus governments in the West, particularly like in America, which they injected monetary, fiscal, credit guarantees, was huge. And I was saying, who's benefiting from this stimulus? A lot of the stimulus checks ended up in people's pockets who were earning more than $100,000 a year. The Fed, to try and intervene in the market, to say that they're propping up and unfreezing markets, was buying commercial paper of AAA credit qualities such as Berkshire Hathaway and all these really well-to-do corporations. So, and then you had this incredible explosion in wealth which took place with people shuttered at home, that the stock market just surged, and the surge in billionaire wealth which took place in the year 2020 was extraordinary, that people are sitting at home, you've shut the economy down, the economy is contracting, but the stock market is surging, and all these billionaires who are there are making tons of wealth sitting at home because the amount of money which has been injected into the system is unprecedented. So it's then really which, like I got me thinking that what's happened to capitalism? This is an economy and this is a country, America, that I was so optimistic on. I came to this country, I wrote such optimistic things about this country. But then when I saw that the way capitalism was being distorted and connected it with the fact in 2020 that the average American is not feeling satisfied. And today, here we are in 2024, and the top 10, 20% of Americans feel that they're doing well. But anyone in the bottom 50, 60% are stressed out in terms of their incomes are getting squeezed. They've got squeezed by, like the high inflation we have had. They've got squeezed by this feeling that, that the rich are benefiting and they don't have the equality of opportunity. And they're also feeling squeezed by the fact that all this liquidity has led to an incredible increase in property prices, but it's put a new home for the average American out of reach. So I think that that's when I really made the connection in the last few years in the post-pandemic, and this book in many ways is a pandemic baby.
This episode is brought to you by Shopify. Whether you're selling a little or a lot, Shopify helps you do your thing, however you cha-ching. From the launch your online shop stage, all the way to the we just hit 1 million orders stage. No matter what stage you're in, Shopify's there to help you grow. Sign up for a $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/special offer, all lowercase. That's shopify.com/special offer.
So there are 3 different major causes of a lot of these problems that you identify in your book. And we've talked about the first 2, these huge bailouts and government spending concentrated on bailing out a lot of individuals and firms. You have federal monetary policy through the Federal Reserve. And then the other one you discuss at length in your book is regulation. And it seems like the thread that ties all these together is where the government is trying to protect people from the consequences of their own behavior, from the consequences of their own decision. How does regulation fit into this model of yours?
Yeah, so I think that when the government sees any problem, the impulse is to regulate. As I say in the book, that the road to hell is paved with good intentions, which is that every time that you see a problem, then you think that, we need to regulate this or that. And as I say in the book, that those regulations, in fact, end up hurting the average person and benefiting the entrenched, particularly the big businesses. How does that happen? So first, let's look at the numbers. That we've had an explosion in new regulations over the last couple of decades. The American government today institutes 3,000 new regulations a year. And that's been going on for the last couple of decades, this massive pace of increase in new regulations. How many regulations has the American government withdrawn over this time period? Over the last 20 years, they've withdrawn 20 regulations in total, right? So just look at this asymmetry that's happened. So now these regulations are happening everywhere. If you want to open a new restaurant, you want to start your own fund, you have to deal with a phalanx of new regulations now. You spoke about my experience in the fund management industry. I know for a fact that the cost of setting up a new fund management operation today, for a fact, is 10 times larger than it was 20 years ago, because you have to comply with new regulations and other things. Now, who benefits from all this? obviously, if you're a big business, the costs of meeting these new regulations is still relatively small. But if you're a new startup or a small, medium-sized business, the costs are incredible to meet those new regulations. Secondly, those same big companies are able to lobby in Washington, given their power and given the money, to write regulations in such a way that benefits them. So the biggest lobbyists in Washington today tend to be the big corporations, particularly the big tech companies. And for the average person, this all feels very onerous in many ways. One, as I said, is just the cost has gone up a lot. So therefore, you have the decline in new companies being formed in America. But secondly, even for the average employee, this means a lot who's already working at a firm. One statistic that I pull out in the book is that today, according to some studies, the average person spends 16% of their time at work dealing with legal compliance courses, other, like red tapeism to meet the regulatory requirements. Can you imagine 16% of the time is being spent on those factors, and that's costing the American economy billions, if not trillions, in dollars of lost output when the average employee is spending 16% of time doing these things. So that's what I try and show, that the regulatory state is really hurting the average person and benefiting the big entrenched businesses with their money power and their influence power in Washington.
Yeah, I mean, it certainly is about 16%, but it certainly feels like a lot more because it's some of the most boring work you're ever going to do on your job. You sort of hit on something right there, which is the influence of large firms in sort of guiding the creation of these new regulations to punish implicitly or explicitly to punish their competitors. Economists call this regulatory capture. It seems like, and this is my my libertarian angle coming out here, it seems like if you have a government that is going to be involved in regulating portions of the economy, and through creating regulations or running a welfare state, these sort of large enterprises, they're going to be moving around trillions or hundreds of billions of dollars and have regulations that impact firms and individuals on every level. It seems almost politically impossible to avoid a situation where this happens, where you're not going to get a large amount of regulatory capture. So what kind of hope do we have for trying to put this genie back into the bottle, or at least build a wall around it?
Well, the first thing is, just to put this out in the public sphere, to raise awareness and consciousness of that. As I say in the book, the first step to a cure is to diagnose the problem. So in terms of that, let's make people aware that this is what's going on, because today, the solution that many people offer whenever there's a problem is even bigger government. If this is a problem, the government needs to intervene and do this. The government needs to, put in more regulation. As I show that at the most charitable thing that you can say about the government is that it's playing whack-a-mole, which is that you put something down in here, then something else pops up somewhere else. So the first thing we have to do is to make people aware. And I think that that's what I've tried to do in this book, which is that you've had some of these arguments out there in the public sphere about the Fed's role, about regulation and stuff. But how do you tie it all together to show in a systematic way that over the last century, how the role of government has crept and gotten bigger and bigger over time, and what are the negative consequences of that already? I think that part of the problem is that many people have been focused on the expanding role of government in a bit of a superficial way. They speak about just government spending, and then there is this constant threat which is raised. We need to increase, the government's, that the government's increasing debt and deficit will lead to a crisis someday. Well, that's not happened. And so unfortunately, that argument today appears stale, a bit discredited. The average person thinks that, all these people keep fear-mongering about these rising debt and deficits. Some people are still worried about it, but it doesn't feel material in any way. And you have a lot of people, economists on the left, dismissive of these arguments, saying that all these people have been telling us about how increased government spending and debt and deficits will lead to a crisis. Nothing has happened. And, America is beyond this. It's the world's biggest financial superpower. The people will keep piling in here. The dollars will keep coming in. We have tech and other strengths in our economy. But what I'm trying to do in the book is to show that these government habits over time extend to just beyond government spending. It's about regulation, it's about bailout, it's about micromanaging the business cycle, it's about socializing risk across the curve from most gallingly for the rich, and that what are the negative consequences that have already happened in terms of declining startups, declining social mobility in America, declining economic mobility in America, where the average person feels that they cannot move up the ladder. Only 35% of Americans today feel that they're going to be better off than their parents, whereas that number a generation or two ago used to be close to 70-80% of the average American felt that they could be better off than their parents. So that's a very depressing feeling, but it's to make the connection that why are people feeling so depressed, even though at the superficial level things appear fine. And that's the connection I'm trying to make in this book. So to again put it here in a summary, which is that first I have to make people aware of what is the problem. Otherwise, you're going to keep doubling down and keep doing the same thing that has got us into this feeling of economic pessimism today.
So you grew up in India, and you, over the course of your life, have seen Indian economic policy transformed. You went from the license Raj to now a much more open free market. Not as much, I think, as either of us would like, but certainly in the right direction. We've seen tremendous benefits. The problem, of course, in the rest of the world is we have this sort of myth that in the beginning of the late 70s and early 1980s, that the US and Western countries became these radical laissez-faire, free market, free trade, free immigration, free capital zones, where anything went. We went to this sort of radical laissez-faire model of capitalism. And you see nowadays right-wingers such as Oren Cass, who is embracing a lot of big government policies, including some aspects of planning and industrial policy, and people on the left like Bernie Sanders, AOC, and others who are saying we've tried this radical laissez-faire policy recently over the last 40 or 50 years. It hasn't led to the outcomes that we want. But you write in your book very convincingly that no, we actually didn't have this. And I believe you use the term the neoliberal revolution was more of a revolution in sort of terminology or in ideas rather than actual policy.
Yes, so I think that it's again important to look at the evidence because I come from a space where I'm very driven by data. And so I look at the evidence that how does this impression gain ground that we are in this neoliberal era where the markets are allowed to rule and conquer people's lives. And so I say that the reason why that happened was because, yes, there were a few, free market policies followed across the world, which included globalization, which is about more, greater free trade. It included the fact that a lot of the former socialist countries from India to China adopted a more free market model. Yes, in countries like America, you had a decline in some union power. When Reagan came to power, government spending's growth declined a bit, but it never really reversed course. So if you look at all the evidence, the fact is that the role of government in Western societies like America has only increased since the 1980s on a net basis. It's not decreased. The reason why we got this impression that we are in this neoliberal era is because of what was mostly happening outside of the Western countries, where a lot of former socialist or even communist countries were giving their people more economic freedom and moving towards a more free market society. It happened because of globalization, where there was a greater embrace of free trade for sure, and also immigration, as you point out. So that led to the impression that we're in this some neoliberal era, and also because of the fact that the financial markets took off and became so big, partly because in the 80s there was some financial market deregulation, but even that reversed. But at least for the 80s it was there for a while, and so markets took off. But as I show in the book, that the main reason the markets have done and financial markets have done so well is partly because, or for a major reason, because of the fact that there is this asymmetry in risk, which is that the big that on the upside, all these firms and companies are benefiting from, like the Fed's policies and like easy money, but on the downside, they have the government's back. But more than that, if you look at all the data objectively, what's happened to government spending as a share of GDP? It's only gone up since the 1980s. What's happened to the government's debt and deficits? It's only gone up significantly since the 1980s, and now we're at a situation where the government's running a deficit, the US government, of 6% of GDP. So we've doubled down, like from the 3% of GDP kind of deficit that we used to run for the last couple of decades. And even that was a radical shift, that in the first 200 years of America's economic history, the government rarely ever ran a deficit. It did so only when there was a major crisis or a war. But in the last 50 years, the American government has run a budget deficit in 45 of those 50 years and a surplus in only 5 of those years, mostly during the Clintons' late second term, when you had a big tech boom and the revenues really took off and there was some spending restraint which was done there. But otherwise, government spending has gone up in the last 100 years from 3% of GDP to 36% today. The government's debt has similarly exploded. The deficit today is at an all-time high as a share of the GDP outside of a major depression or so. So on every scale, then we've spoken about regulation, we've spoken about the culture of bailouts. On every single metric, the role of government has increased. So in my book, in terms of the real problem of the last 30 to 40 years has not been some big neoliberal era that has undermined the life of the average American. It's been the role of government that's gone ahead. So the tagline I have in the book is that capitalism was ruined by big government. That's really what's happened. Capitalism is not functioning today in the way it was supposed to function, which is supposed to be pro-competition, pro-churn, pro-creative destruction. A lot of that is not happening today.
So you've mentioned in the interview in your book about how folks have been worried about deficits and the government debt for a long time. They've been saying that doom is going to happen. It hasn't happened yet. So a lot of those concerns are now just sort of wiped away. They're just gone. I hear very few people in politics or outside of politics even talking about these big issues. Some of my colleagues aside, of course, who are talking about these issues in very big ways. So it hasn't happened. We haven't had a fiscal crisis. But there are obviously limits beyond, just politics. How do you think this is going to unfold? When are there going to actually be limits, and how on what the government can spend, on debt, on borrowing, on deficits? When are we going to see those, you think, and how are we going to see that manifest? How is that going to actually hit the real world?
Well, unfortunately, the history of nations is that unless and until a country hits a crisis point, which means that the government literally runs out of money to spend more, there is very rarely a course correction. In the book, I give examples of countries like Greece or countries like even Sweden, which many liberals cite as their paragon of economic virtue, that those countries also got into big trouble because their government spending increased too much and it got out of control. Sweden in the 1990s was forced to reform when government spending got out of control. Its deficit and debt were too large, and then they were forced to prune it back. So in fact, Sweden is such an interesting case that the liberals hold up, but I think that they sort of missed this important detail in history, which is that Sweden too has been cutting back its government spending as a share of GDP and become much more fiscally responsible after it got into crisis in the 1990s. And in fact, it entered the 2008 financial crisis with a pretty significant government surplus. So that's a big change that happened there. But the unfortunate examples from history is that unless and until you get to a riot point or a crisis point, governments do not course correct. So as far as America is concerned, because it is the world's biggest superpower and the dollar is still the world's reserve currency, it has a very long rope in a way to hang itself, that it can keep on running these debt and deficits for much longer than other ordinary nations can. Having said that, I think that we're getting to a point where this is getting quite scary, because as I said, that today America's deficit as a share of GDP is 6%. it's much higher than any developed country is running. Similarly, America's debt as a share of its GDP today has gone above 100% and is lagging that of only Japan and Italy, and we will cross even the Italian levels as a share of the economy by the end of this decade, given the current path we are on. So I think that we're getting to a point now where these very large debt and deficits could become a real problem, because even America, with all its resources, may run out of people who are willing to fund it and may demand higher and higher interest rates to pay for it. And then that becomes a negative feedback loop, because if an increasing share of the government's revenues go to just paying interest on its debt, then it begins to compromise the government's ability to spend on anything else, including on welfare. So that's the fear I have, that so far we have not had any crisis, and we have said that all these people have been fear-mongering and they've all been wrong for a long period of time. And now, though we have taken this argument to a different level, where we are saying it doesn't matter how much debt and deficits we run, it could be 6%. If we have a downturn, the loss in revenues will mean that our deficit gets to 9 or 10%. It doesn't matter. It's America, and because everyone's been wrong about these fears before, this can continue. But that's exactly what then what sows the seeds for the next crisis. So that's what worries me about the future. But as I say in the book, that my focus is to first point out that what has already happened, what's the damage that has already been caused, because at least let's raise awareness of what's happened rather than waiting for the crisis to come and then starting the course correction.
Yeah, and we're set right now to get even higher levels of debt and GDP and spending sort of on autopilot. Historically, right, at the end of World War II, the debt to GDP ratio was about the same as it is now, a little bit higher. But the spending ended because the war ended. And so the government could run some surpluses, it could reduce spending, it could cut taxes a little bit and still maintain the ability to pay off the debt incurred during World War II. Now we're at this phase where the baby boomers are retiring in very large numbers. They are starting to draw down significantly on Social Security and Medicare, to the extent where the Congressional Budget Office projects that the Social Security Trust Fund, which is really a phantom fund anyway, but that on paper it'll be exhausted in the early 2030s, and Medicare Trust Fund A is going to be exhausted even earlier. And I don't think any serious person looking at this thinks that Congress is going to sit around and do nothing when these points happen. They're going to fund benefits out of general revenues, and they're going to borrow a lot of money going forward, and we're going to get more and more close to this example where all of a sudden it's going to be prohibitively expensive to borrow, or people just won't lend money to the federal government because they don't think they're going to get their act together. At that point, knowing what you know about political incentives in the United States, about what voters think, what you've delved into in this book, and what voters think, and what politicians think, and what others think, do you think Americans are going to choose higher taxes and less growth to shore up these benefits, or are they going to choose to cut these benefits and get a little bit of dynamism back?
Well, I still have some optimism about America in the end. What was that famous Churchill quote, that America does the right thing after having tried every other option? So I think that once we get to that point, I'm optimistic that the role of government will begin to get dialed back, and that America will course correct. So I think that I feel that that's when the spending cuts will happen, when it becomes apparent to people about what's happened with this runaway growth in spending. And that's what even happened in other economies, from Sweden to Greece as well, as I cite in the book. So I think that eventually I feel that America will do this right, but unfortunately I don't see that point now. So for me, the immediate focus is to point out, as I have in the book, that what's the history of capitalism, what's happened, and let's, like that definition of insanity is that, that if you keep sort of doing the same thing and expecting different outcomes, that's just not, that's a definition of insanity. So at least let's get to a point where we define, okay, what's the problem today? Why, is this an issue that we need to be looking at? And also it's an ode to capitalism, which is that, yes, capitalism can still work if you keep giving people economic freedom. And I think that's the path that America has been straying away from, which is that, if you look at these indices of economic freedom, America would rank in the top 5 for decades. Now it's slipped all the way to number 25. And we need to be aware that what's getting us there and how that's hurting the average American.
So is one political party, you think, more to blame with the others, or is this just like a bipartisan effort to get us away from economic freedom?
No, I think this has been a bipartisan project, because even someone like Trump came to power in 2016 talking, like the language of deregulation, talking the language of, like doing something for the average American. But if you looked at his track record in terms of even on things like deregulation, he didn't move the needle much. He spoke about that, but by the end of his term, he had put in so many new regulations that, the regulatory picture in America did not change that much. Similarly, when it comes to debt and deficits, he ran the largest deficit by cutting taxes during a peacetime effort, and in terms of the fact that with no matching spending cuts. So this has really been a bipartisan project, but yes, the Biden administration in the last 3 years has taken this to a totally different level and magnitude. It's doubled down on everything. So this has been a progression where even the icons of so-called free market capitalism, such as Reagan and Thatcher, did not do much to reverse the role of government. If you just look at metrics such as government spending or regulation, that was done under their era. But here, under Trump, and then now under Biden in particular, we've taken this to a totally new level. And that's the kind of awareness I'm trying to raise through this book.
And you really do raise it consistently and thoughtfully throughout the entire book. I'm glad you brought up these statements by Trump about deregulation and how the statements have really fed into this perception that Trump was this radical free market president expanding capitalism, where the opposite was true. I mean, spending as a percent of GDP went up, trade barriers, enormous numbers of new regulations, immigration restrictions on the flow of labor across borders, just an enormous amount of increase in that. And then you have on the other side, and then Trump also, by the way, says about, American carnage and how bad Americans have it and how terrible it is. And then Democrats will say the same thing, how awful it is in the United States, how Americans have it terribly in this country. And you explain how this perception feeds in to this idea, these statements feed into the perception that capitalism is, crushing people's economic opportunity, when really it's the government doing this in most areas. But I am kind of concerned, or I guess interested in the book, because you have that as half of it, this perception, and how the perception is that capitalism is ruining people when it's the government. And then on the other hand, you also give a little bit of credence to some of the ideas on the other side, right? The idea that inequality is increasing and that this is a bad thing. Are you, and I know you struggle with this in the book, about whether giving too much credit to the people who are skeptical of capitalism on these areas of like economic equality or inequality can undermine capitalism a little bit, can undermine and push for a lot of these policies you propose. How do you reconcile this about equality and inequality and what the government's doing, these perceptions?
Yeah, no, as I say in the book, that I don't expect capitalism to produce income equality necessarily, because as I said, that capitalism is about equality of opportunity. It's not about equality of outcomes, because any capitalist society should reward meritocracy more. But what I say in the book is the fact that it's that the kind of policies the government has followed has fueled inequality and fueled the sense that there is an inequality of opportunity as well because of declining economic and social mobility. And even the billionaires are getting the feeling that, that they can survive much longer, because yes, there will be billionaires produced under any capitalist society, but there should be a feeling of churn, that the top billionaires keep changing over time. Now the average billionaire stays on that list of billionaires for much longer than in the past. The entrenched billionaire has become much more of a common feature now. So I think that's the way that I try and reconcile this, which is that, yes, capitalism will lead to wealth and income inequality. There's no denying on that. But it should lead to it in a reasonable way, and it should come from a space that there is equality of opportunity. Instead, we have today these incredibly easy money policies, first by the Fed and then all these government interventions from regulation to bailouts that have kept the billionaires more entrenched. And as I've said so earlier, that during periods of very easy money, it's led to an explosion in billionaire wealth without them having to do much. So I think that it's that feeling which needs to be corrected for the average American. Otherwise, I think the average American celebrates, and in fact, some ways still celebrates wealth creation in a way, and see many of these billionaires as people that they can aspire to or look up to. But when the feeling is that those billionaires are creating their wealth just because of government help or too much easy money, I think that that's what fuels resentment.
So your concern is the source of the inequality rather than the inequality yourself. Let me just ask you a hypothetical then. Let's say, we have the types of free market policies that you support. We don't have these bailouts. We don't have this crushing of creative destruction. But we get a situation where economic inequality is the same as it is now. Do you see economic inequality as a problem then, or is it just still the source that matters?
Yes, I think the source is more important, but I'm also willing to bet that if the government was not following those policies, we would not have such high levels of wealth inequality. Because I think the source is the problem. So in fact, this is a very interesting thing that, I created this index over a decade ago called the Billionaires Index. And what that did was that it used three metrics to measure the wealth of a nation and inequality across the world. Those three metrics were: what is the share of billionaire wealth of the economy? From where has that wealth been created? Is it in industries which are innovative and don't require much government help, or has the billionaire wealth been created because of industries such as real estate or even commodities which require a lot of government help? And the third, that how much of this wealth that the billionaires have created is inherited, and how much of it is something which is self-made. So I created that formula to say that whenever that the countries around the world where there's too much billionaire wealth as the share of the economy, and too much of it is being created by the so-called rent-seeking industries, and a lot of it is just inherited wealth, those are countries much more susceptible to populist revolts compared to countries where the wealth is much more created due to innovation and is not so much in your face. So I think that since you raised this topic, this billionaire index is something that I pay a lot of attention to, and that looks at the source as much as the size. But yes, I'm willing to make the argument that if the government was not playing this role to distort capitalism this much, we would not only have a better source problem, but even the share would not be as large and disproportionate of the economy as it is today.
So one of the things I'm a little worried about in your prescription here, and play along with me and tell me why you think I'm wrong about this, is that if we give a lot of credence to the idea that inequality is getting worse and that this is a bad thing sort of in principle, then we open ourselves up to more of these policies that increase moral hazard, to more redistribution, to more bailouts, maybe targeted more at people on the lower end of the socioeconomic spectrum, and then we get more of these problems that we talk about. One of the things I've come to think over the years is that a lot of the support for redistribution and higher taxes on the wealthy and trying to take their resources and give the people less fortunate, some of it I think comes from the good places that you're talking about. People are aghast at the inequalities, they're aghast at what they think is a lack of opportunity. But in most cases, or at least half of cases it's more of a case of like malicious envy, right? Where a lot of people just really don't like successful people and want to take their money and hurt them, even if it hurts themselves in the process. Do you think I'm off base with that?
No, I mean, but I make it very clear in the book, which is the fact that I am in favor of equality of opportunity, but I totally understand that, and we need to appreciate that capitalism does lead to inequality of wealth and inequality of income. So I think that the idea of leveling inequality is misguided on its own, because then you have socialism, and that's what the kind of India I came from, where any wealth that was made was taxed away, and so people didn't create any wealth. So I'm all for wealth creation, but as I said, it's about the idea that you have to have a feeling there's equality of opportunity, and America had that. As I say in the book, that right up until 3-4 decades ago, when most Americans felt that they could be better off than their parents, when most Americans felt that they could afford to buy a home, there was no great, sort of talk about inequality. This talk of inequality has really surged as we have seen a surge in the number of new billionaires which have been created, as those billionaires have become more entrenched. I think that's where we have seen this surge take place, and sometimes the government's solution for these is, only makes things worse. I mean, the one thing that the government's now doing much more is they think that they have to spend a lot more on the welfare state to protect, people and against this anger that's been building up. But in doing that, I think that they, in terms of that, they're only sort of making things a bit worse, because, you keep spending so much, you're compromising on the fact that you're doing it in a way that will be unsustainable, and so in the future you will not be able to support even these many people given the amount you're spending today. So I think that there has to be an appreciation of the fact that equality of opportunity is what the focus needs to be, not in terms of eliminating inequality. That's not what capitalism is about.
One of the sections of your book that I thought was really extraordinary is you explain bureaucrats and politicians and other government employees making decisions about regulations, and how this basically uniformly pushes in one direction, which is more regulations, more control, more bailouts, more protection for firms that have these political connections. But then I was a little surprised. In another section, you wrote about your support for antitrust laws and more vigorous enforcement of antitrust laws and competition policy. And there, can you try to reconcile these things for me? Because I do see a lot of antitrust policy, at least historically, and today I think with some work by Lena Khan at the FTC, is like a fairly arbitrary, fairly capricious, leads to a lot of uncertainty in the markets. So I'm just curious, how do you sort of reconcile this seeming contradiction, or is it even a contradiction? Am I misreading you?
No, I think that, as I said, that I think that the first step is that the role of government has expanded a lot, but I'm not in the camp which believes that the government should have zero role, which is that there is a role for government when there's a crisis, when there is a role for government in providing some basic welfare, like for a society. And on the antitrust, I think that when things get too far, something needs to be done about it, which is the fact that something is wrong in America when a handful of companies are earning extraordinary amount of profits, and then they're using those profits to just keep gobbling up new entrants, which slows down the pace of innovation, and then they're using those incredible amount of profits to lobby in Washington to get regulations done in the way that suits them. And also then, in terms of any new technology which comes, which requires massive spending, only these companies seem to have the cash to be able to do that. So I do feel that capitalism at its true level should naturally work in a way where not just a handful of companies make supernormal profits, but the profits are more distributed. So I'm all for private sector enterprise making lots of profits. But when you reach a point where just a handful of companies are making extraordinary profit, then something has gone wrong somewhere. We need to recognize that. Otherwise, that's not going to end. The fact that the same companies dominate the lists of the top companies, like Microsoft or whatever you want to call, at the top of the pyramid every decade, there's something which has gone a bit wrong there. So yes, I agree that you can't have arbitrary antitrust or those kind of policies, but I think that's one area where I do feel we need to closely examine that these big tech companies, the way they've come to dominate not only our lives, but the entire investment landscape. And this is not just about their innovative ability. It's the fact that they're producing these extraordinary level of profits, which is inconsistent with any capitalist society, because capitalism at the core needs to be pro-competition, pro-churn, and pro-new companies coming up. So that's the concern I have, that there's something which we need to do about antitrust, which is the fact that in a systematic way, where these big companies are not just going to keep gobbling up all the small companies and have a disproportionate influence on our lives. And it happens in many ways, which is that one of the big frustrations of many Americans today is the fact that many towns in America today are dominated by just one big company. And when that one big company dominates that town, they have, this incredible amount of bargaining power, and then it also creates this feeling, for the average person that they're being oppressed because they, are just being forced to work for that one big company, and they get to set all the rules. So the domination of these handful of very big companies, I think, is inconsistent with a true capitalist system. And so therefore, I have some sympathy with the antitrust being enforced in a more systematic way. But we need to recognize that at times when that happens, something wrong has happened. Of course, I argue that the origin of that is too much regulation, so we need to do something about that too. We just can't do antitrust and then expect that this is going to go away, because if you don't deal with the source of the problem, which is too much regulation, too much easy money, then that problem is just going to come back after you've arbitrarily killed off something. So it needs to work all thoughtfully rather than on a piecemeal basis, that you deal with antitrust, but you don't deal with the source cause of what's led to this big domination of these companies.
Right. And if you want to just, because we're about to wrap up here, but if you don't mind, in 30 seconds, your book gives us a lot to worry about in the United States, some reasons for hope. Why don't you tell us what's the biggest reason why you're optimistic about the future of the United States and economic freedom here and capitalism?
Because I think that eventually America does the right thing after having tried all options, which is that I expect that America in the end will course correct. It's a country that has done so, and the fact that we can have this free debate out here, I think is great. The fact that I'm being able to put this argument out here is terrific. I can't put this argument out there in China, and even in places like India and all, it's more difficult to do so. The fact that I can put this argument out there, and the fact that it's early days, but the book has just come out, and I'm getting a lot of positive feedback from both the right and the left on some of these issues, makes me optimistic. The fact that as someone put it, that this is a capitalist critique of capitalism, and I say because that someone from the inside has seen this, and also from the outside has seen it as an immigrant who came from a socialist country. So the fact that I can put this argument out there, we can have this hour-long debate here and discussion, still gives me reason that in the end, America will course correct.
Well, thank you, Ruchir. I really appreciate it. And the book is What Went Wrong with Capitalism. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Enjoyed that.
Thanks for listening to this week's Afterwards podcast. If you are interested in podcasts about nonfiction books, listen to C-SPAN's Book Notes Plus podcast for interviews with authors and historians hosted by Brian Lamb.